Dusk slid between the pines, stripping color from everything it touched. A young grizzly hung bound to a tree, thick hemp sawing into the wet fur of his chest. Blood had dried to tar around the bullet lodged beneath his shoulder blade. The forest around him held no mercy, only the patient rhythm of predators closing in. Wolves ghosted through underbrush, their breath forming thin ribbons of fog. Flies hovered near the wound. Sap bled slow from the bark as if the tree wept for both of them. Each creak of rope sounded like a countdown, every shallow breath a refusal to surrender. The light faded to iron gray, and still the bear stood, trembling, refusing to fall. Nothing human remained here, only cold intention and the heavy scent of gunpowder and pine. In that silence, cruelty waited to be claimed by the dark, and the forest prepared to swallow what man had made. Miles south, Ethan Cole walked alone along an abandoned service trail. His pack was heavy with camera batteries, his mind heavier with fatigue. The reserve's maps said turn east before dusk, yet his boots veered off course, following a path shaped by instinct more than plan. Wind slid low through ferns, carrying a faint sound that did not belong, half breath, half plea. He stopped. The forest leaned in with him, waiting. Another rasp came, broken and wet, like air dragged through torn lungs. Ethan moved forward cautiously, each step dissolving under moss. The smell thickened. Iron, salt, and something older. The trees opened abruptly, revealing a clearing smeared with shadow and scarlet. A figure loomed there, bound upright against a pine, motionless except for the slow convulsion of breathing. His pulse quickened, the logic of work colliding with the pull of conscience. Whatever had made that sound was still alive and utterly alone.
The clearing felt stripped of time, a stage left after violence. Rope bid deep into the bear's neck and chest, bark worn smooth by struggle. Ethan's boots sank into damp earth, darkened with blood. He had read about cruelty this deliberate, but never walked inside it. The bullet wound still leaked, a slow heartbeat of black. Regulations whispered in memory, injured predators are to be avoided, not approached. He took another step anyway. The air trembled with the scent of copper and resin. Above, a raven shifted branches, wings scraping bark like a judge clearing its throat. Ethan touched the rope. It was rough, soaked, and pulsed faintly with trapped heat. The bear's eye rolled once toward him, clouded, dim, but aware. Fear and pity braided together inside his ribs. Somewhere beyond, a single wolf answered the dusk, its call circling back as if summoning witness to unfinished cruelty. The knife blade flashed once, then dulled with sap and blood. Ethan worked it beneath the first loop, breath measured against the sound of the sawing edge. Each fiber resisted like muscle. Wind pressed low across the ground, carrying the wolves' scent closer. They paced, beyond the line of sight, their patience part of the ritual. The bear quivered, neither fighting nor surrendering, his body too tired for choices. Ethan's hand cramped. Still he cut. Rope strands frayed, swelling with moisture and heat. Minutes folded into hours. A final strand parted and the body collapsed forward, heavy as truth itself. Dirt met fur, and the earth accepted the weight without judgment. Ethan pressed his jacket against the bleeding shoulder, warmth seeping through fabric to fur. The wolves lingered at the boundary of courage and hunger, uncertain which scent to follow. Night closed like a curtain, leaving only breathing to prove existence.
Night deepened until every sound carried consequence. Rain began, thin as wire, tracing cold paths along Ethan's arms. The bear lay slumped, ribs shivering beneath the weight of exhaustion. Steam lifted faintly where body heat met wet earth. Ethan struck a branch against stone, the crack ricocheting through trees. The wolves retreated into shadow, insulted by noise. Silence returned dense and uneven. His muscles ached from dragging, His shoulder burned, yet he stayed crouched beside the fallen creature. The forest smelled of iron and resin, raw and endless. Somewhere behind cloud cover, dawn prepared itself, a pale thought not yet visible. Hours bled into one another until color returned. The bear still breathed, barely, but enough. Ethan's pulse matched it, steady and defiant. The rain slowed, leaving the world rinsed and hollow. For now, cruelty had been delayed, not erased, and survival balanced on the fragile rhythm of two imperfect hearts. Morning arrived colorless, its chill sharp enough to split resolve. Ethan gathered rope and tarp, building a crude sled on instinct. The bear's weight was unbearable, yet momentum disguised impossibility. Each pull tore at his injured shoulder. Each pause tasted of failure. Mud clung to his boots. Frost smoked off his breath. Above the ridge, ravens trailed silently, measuring persistence. He counted steps instead of distance, dragging the body toward the faint hope of a road. Hours stretched thin until the first echo of an engine threaded the air. He stumbled forward, waving through haze as a ranger's truck emerged. Tires hissed, brakes screamed, hands replaced disbelief. They lifted together, flesh and metal groaning in unison. Blood marked every surface like punctuation. Ethan climbed into the truck bed, one hand resting on coarse fur. Beneath his palm, a faint tremor answered, as if life had chosen not to let go.
The forest dissolved into antiseptic glare. White tiles reflected fluorescent hum, a sound too clean for memory. Talon, the name Lauren Grant murmured into the medical chart, lay sedated beneath surgical light. Monitors stitched rhythm from uncertainty. She worked quietly, gloved fingers tracing destruction left by intent. Director Mason Reed observed from the doorway, expression folded into neutrality, already calculating headlines. Ethan sat against the wall, his hands raw, mud dried into the lines of his skin. The bullet slid free with a muted click, dropped into a metal tray that rang far too loud. Sutures followed, closing what men had opened. When silence returned, it felt fragile, borrowed. The bear's chest rose once, then again, shallow but consistent. Outside, wind scratched at the windows, pine needles tapping like distant claws. Inside, the room exhaled collectively, uncertain whether to call this survival or temporary defiance against the arithmetic of loss. Days unspooled in sterile rhythm. Talon slept beneath the heat of heat lamps, fur glistening with antiseptic oil. His breathing steadied, each exhale fogging glass panels built for smaller lives. Ethan lingered beyond visiting hours, a silhouette carved from fatigue. Dr. Grant moved between enclosures, her clipboard a shield against attachment. Director Mason Reed discussed liability and optics with clipped precision, words that scraped the air like insects trapped indoors. Yet something beyond procedure grew quietly, a pulse of shared endurance neither science nor policy could quantify. Outside, frost bit through soil. Inside, patience replaced adrenaline. Talon stirred in dreams, muscles twitching as if rehearsing freedom. The scent of pine oil and fur thickened until the sterile room felt alive again. In those muted hours, man and creature breathed within the same fragile boundary, separated by glass but tethered by something older than survival, the simple insistence to remain. Healing proved a slow argument between instinct and will. Talon refused food, his eyes reflecting nothing but the color of the lamp above. Ethan returned each morning, presence alone serving as medicine. He never touched the fence, yet distance became communion. Lauren documented vitals that spoke of decline, but her gaze told another story. She noticed how the bear's scars mirrored the same pattern from a decade-old case, rope burns left by the same hunter's knot. Memory crept under her professionalism, tightening her throat. Days passed without sound except for breath and the whisper of shifting straw. Then, almost imperceptibly, Talon lifted his head, eyes clearer, jaw flexing.
He moved closer to the fence, not in aggression, but awareness. The air changed. Even machines seemed to quiet. Healing, she realized, began not with medicine, but with recognition. One living thing acknowledging another's refusal to vanish. Weeks gathered their quiet victories. Talon began to eat, slow, deliberate bites that turned necessity into ritual. Fur thickened, muscles repaired their own faith. Ethan watched from the corridor, shoulders bandaged, exhaustion turning to wary calm. Dr. Grant adjusted the final dressing, expression detached, but softened by wonder she would not name. Director Reed observed from his office window, measuring expenses against headlines, the moral cost still invisible on spreadsheets. Outside, frost coated the rails. The wind pressed through pines, whispering the memory of freedom. Inside, the air carried warmth that did not belong to machinery. Talon's eyes followed the shifting light, and for the first time he blinked slowly, not from pain, but peace. The ghosts of rope and blood still lingered, yet their power diminished. Healing was not forgiveness, only continuation. The forest waited beyond the walls, patient as gravity, preparing to reclaim what had nearly been erased.
Winter pressed against the glass, whitening the world beyond the clinic. Inside, heaters hummed while the air smelled of saline and fur. Talon moved more each day, slow arcs of strength rediscovering itself. Ethan slept less, afraid that absence would undo progress. Lauren charted improvement, her notes losing the sterility of science. Director Reed signed new papers for relocation, language wrapped in words like containment and safety. Bureaucracy drifted through the corridors like cold smoke. Talon's eyes followed shapes beyond the window, the way winds sculpted snow into motion. Each breath carried weight, each pause the echo of something unspoken. The bear's pulse had grown steadier, yet captivity bruised the rhythm. Outside, branches rattled under ice. Inside, resolve hardened. Healing had arrived, but peace had not, and somewhere in the distance the forest whispered its own verdict, reminding them that recovery without freedom is only another restraint. The first rumor came from a ranger's radio, static carrying fragments of an arrest north of the valley. A hunter, possession of illegal traps, photographs, trophies, proof of repetition rather than regret. In one image, Lauren recognized the tree, same grain, same scar, same rope pattern that matched Talon's wounds. News reached Reed before conscience could intervene. He deleted emails, closed folders, and spoke of ongoing investigations. Ethan listened, silent, understanding that cruelty never acted alone. It needed permission disguised as policy. Snow continued falling, soft and relentless. Inside the clinic, Talon's breath clouded against the glass, unaware of headlines forming around his pain. Justice existed in paperwork, not in healing. The hunters had names, the bear had only a scar. Yet beneath sedation and stitches, something ancient waited. The memory of a forest unfinished with vengeance, and a man beginning to understand the weight of letting anything survive.
Days lengthened again, pale light stretching through the rafters. The clinic's routines thickened with caution. Talon's appetite returned in earnest, and with strength came restlessness. His claws scraped concrete like a metronome of frustration. Ethan watched, recognizing the hunger in motion, the way captivity corrodes courage. Reed convened meetings, voices sharp with risk assessments. Lauren kept silent, eyes on her clipboard, but heart elsewhere. Each line of protocol built another wall between them and the wilderness waiting outside. The wolves' howls had grown distant, yet their absence felt heavier than their presence. On the 12th morning, frost melted from the glass in tear-like streaks. Talon stood fully, shoulders high, head tilted toward unseen wind. The gesture looked less like recovery and more like remembrance. Behind the reflection, Ethan caught his own tired silhouette, realizing that both of them were healing from the same invisible leash. Bureaucracy thickened like fog. Reed's office filled with calls, each one layering another justification for removing the bear. Words such as risk and public pressure replaced compassion. Outside the window, winter sunlight glared off snowfields, blinding and pure, indifferent to reason. Ethan reviewed the transfer order folded in his pocket, the signature a brand across conscience. Lauren found him at the enclosure one evening, but said nothing. Understanding passed between silences. Inside, Talon paced, the rhythm of confinement echoing like a clock counting down. Machines blinked, cameras recorded compliance. Somewhere in that mechanical hush, a decision began forming. Quiet, inevitable, as natural as thaw following frost. The forest beyond the ridge shimmered faintly in twilight. Freedom existed less as destination and more as demand, carried in the pulse of everything that had ever refused to die quietly.
By March, the snow receded, exposing mud veined with thaw. The facility smelled of damp straw and disinfectant, a mixture that spoke of endings disguised as care. Talon had outgrown sedation. Tranquilizers barely slowed his defiance. Reed drafted the relocation announcement, each word calibrated for public comfort. Lauren delivered progress charts, numbers that hid unease. Ethan spent evenings tracing escape routes through satellite maps, memorizing where roads stopped and wilderness resumed. Guilt moved between them like static, unspoken, yet audible. The bear's breath fogged the observation glass, each exhale marking seconds left before containment. Outside, pine branches shivered against fences, their needles whispering old coordinates. Somewhere in the valley, wolves crossed melting streams, their reflections fractured by current. Change was coming in many forms, none of them legal. The earth smelled of awakening, and under every surface, something waited to move again. A thunderstorm arrived early that year, tearing across the ridge before spring settled. Lightning burned through clouds, outlining the tree line in ghostly pulses. The power flickered, alarms complained, then steadied. Inside, Reed cursed under breath while staff rushed to secure enclosures. Ethan used the chaos as a rehearsal, counting seconds between flashes, mapping blind zones left by failing lights. Lauren pretended to assist elsewhere, her ID card left on the counter like coincidence. Rain slammed the windows, flattening shadows. Talon stirred, uneasy with pressure changes only wild creatures interpret correctly. The scent of ozone replaced antiseptic. Time thinned to opportunity. Freedom often arrives dressed as disorder. The storm's growl deepened, shaking foundations. Ethan waited, heart synchronized to thunder, eyes fixed on the keycard's dim reflection. Somewhere beyond the facility walls, the forest was roaring, not in rage, but in recognition, calling back one of its stolen sons.
Darkness reclaimed the compound in intervals, light blinking like memory loss. Ethan moved through corridors where power lines hummed faintly under strain. Water pooled across the floors, carrying reflections of exit signs and distant sirens. Talon paced behind reinforced glass, every step deliberate, waiting for something unseen. Ethan's shadow crossed the sensor without triggering alarms. The outage had muted their vigilance. He reached the gate, pulse steady, mind emptied of hesitation. Lightning revealed the forest beyond, dripping, infinite, forgiving. Behind him, machines faltered back to life, their sudden brightness forcing speed. He pressed the release lever, steel hinges protested with a low groan. The world exhaled wet air that smelled of soil and electricity. For the first time in months, unfiltered wind touched fur. Talon hesitated, nostrils flaring, body trembling under the impossible invitation of open space. Rain thickened to curtains of silver, erasing outlines, smudging boundaries between sky and ground. Ethan walked beside the bear through half-flooded grass, boots sinking with each step. Talon moved slowly, every motion rediscovering wild gravity. The forest swallowed them without question. Branches bent, releasing water like blessings. Behind, sirens blurred with thunder, distance turning urgency into rumor. Reed's office lights flickered as his monitor showed only static where the enclosure feed once streamed. Lauren stood in a doorway, the keycard gone, her expression unreadable to anyone but herself. In the woods, lightning split a pine, scenting the air with burning resin. Ethan stopped near the ridge, breath ragged but clear. The bear paused beside him, massive against the downpour. They stood without contact, united by exhaustion and choice. Freedom had no sound, only the absence of walls echoing inside every heartbeat that refused to surrender.
By dawn, the storm had emptied itself over miles of wilderness. Steam rose from soil, turning the forest floor into breath. Ethan crouched beneath a fallen trunk, water dripping steadily from his hair. The bear had vanished somewhere beyond the ravine, leaving only deep prints that filled slowly with runoff. Each footprint was a paragraph in a story the world might never read. Behind him, engines murmured. Search teams combed the lower slopes, shouting names like prayers. He remained still until their voices receded into distance. The forest accepted him quietly, covering his scent with pine and smoke. In that pause between pursuit and discovery, he felt a strange stillness, neither guilt nor triumph, just belonging. Somewhere upriver, wolves answered dawn, their calls stitched with recognition. The storm was over, but its echo lived on in everything that dared to move again. At sunrise, the facility lay hushed under fog. Reporters gathered outside fences glistening with rain. Director Reed rehearsed explanations built from half-truths, phrases polished for comfort. Lauren moved through empty corridors collecting instruments, her badge deactivated. On the outer gate, someone had written in chalk, "The real miracle is when nature dares to trust again." No one claimed the words. They glowed faintly in the damp, trembling with condensation. Inside, cages stood open, straw scattered like aftermath. The scent of animal and antiseptic mingled until neither felt dominant. Beyond the compound, the forest remained silent, concealing its secret without loyalty or malice. Reed stared into that silence, seeing only reflection. Somewhere unseen, Talon was breathing under trees, muscles tightening with renewed certainty. Freedom had taken shape not as rebellion, but as restoration. And the world, for a brief, unmeasured moment, remembered what it meant to let go.
The headlines arrived before the truth. Technician vanishes after releasing dangerous grizzly. Newspapers printed Ethan's photo beside Talon's blurred image, fear packaged for breakfast tables. Mason Reed faced interviews with phrases rehearsed to sound human. Dr. Lauren Grant refused cameras altogether. Inside the facility, the smell of bleach and rain lingered like regret. Outside, volunteers scrubbed the chalk message from the gate, but the words stained memory instead of walls. The investigation expanded, statements twisted, motives simplified. Yet beyond human reach, in the ridges north of the valley, a bear moved through fog, his shoulder scar pale against damp fur. The wild had no interest in justice or rumor. It only absorbed and reshaped. Each step left no sound, only indentation, the quiet grammar of existence rewritten without permission. Somewhere beneath those trees, survival was learning again how to breathe without audience or apology. The forest reclaimed its order quickly. Rain softened tracks, moss grew over fallen rope fibers, and silence filled the vacancy left by pursuit. Ethan camped along the old fire road, a figure half feral from sleeplessness and fear. He moved at dawn and dusk, eating sparingly, speaking to no one. At night, he heard howls threading the ridges, uncertain whether they belonged to wolves or memory. Down below, helicopters scanned heat signatures that always came too late. He began marking trees for orientation, not as territory but gratitude. Each notch in bark felt like a small prayer to the wilderness that had hidden him. The world outside the valley forgot quickly. Another story took its place. Cleaner, easier. In the quiet heart of the forest, a scarred bear hunted rivers alone, both fugitive and sovereign, the wilderness reshaping him into what he had always been before captivity.
Months unfolded into seasons. Snow returned, muted and weightless, burying every remnant of machinery and man. Talon roamed widely now, muscles built back by necessity, strength measured in endurance rather than anger. He crossed rivers frozen thin, followed salmon runs by scent memory, marked trees older than the scars on his body. Sometimes the wind carried a faint echo of human scent, brief and fading. He neither fled nor approached. Freedom had made him fluent in restraint. In a clearing deep in the range, a wolf pack yielded passage, their eyes lowering as instinct recognized something beyond dominance. The forest accepted his presence again, not as a miracle, but as correction. Meanwhile, far to the south, a ranger reported claw marks higher than any known bear could reach. No one filed a report. Some truths belong to rumor, others to the quiet authority of persistence. Dr. Grant left the rehabilitation center within months, her resignation framed as exhaustion but rooted in conviction. She took only her notes, detailed logs of pulse rates, recovery charts, and a folder labeled Talon. Each night she reviewed them, realizing data could not contain grace. Mason Reed remained, overseeing funding audits and interviews that dulled into routine. The scandal cooled, but something in his office air never cleared. He kept a photo on his desk, the scarred pine, bark stripped bare. No one knew why. Outside, winter loosened its grip. The valley began to breathe again, its rivers thawing into quiet silver veins. Somewhere beyond that horizon, the creature they had all reduced to paperwork was still moving through mist, unmeasured by science or guilt. What remained inside those who'd witnessed him was not memory, but a question that refused to find an answer worth speaking aloud.
Ethan emerged months later from the wilderness, thinner, quieter, skin marked by insect bites and sun. Civilization met him with suspicion. He found work repairing weather stations farther north, using a false surname and leaving no forwarding address. Nights were long there, filled with aurora shimmer and the low moan of wind against ice. He read little, spoke less. Yet some mornings he woke with the sense of being watched, not in fear, but recognition. Tracks near his camp were large, deliberate, fading before dawn. He never followed them. Distance had become reverence. Beneath layers of isolation, guilt settled into purpose. He sent anonymous donations to wildlife programs, each envelope unsigned. The world labeled him reckless, the forest labeled him forgiven. Between those verdicts, he built a kind of peace, neither absolution nor exile, just the ongoing work of living with what one has chosen. The following spring brought renewal disguised as rumor. Fishermen spoke of a massive bear sitting beside the river, watching salmon leap, yet taking none. Hikers found paw prints near melted snowfields, each step measured, never panicked. Rangers logged sightings, but doubted their significance. The description varied, but the scar remained constant. An old wound turned legend. For some, he was proof that the wild could heal itself. For others, a reminder of danger never truly contained. To Ethan, reading brief notes in local papers, every word felt like heartbeat. He cut the clippings carefully, storing them between pages of his field journal. At dusk, he'd light a fire, the smoke curling upward like a signal no one needed to decode. Somewhere north, under the same sky, a creature he once freed breathed the same thin air, both of them survivors of choices that had no undoing.
Lauren Grant began speaking publicly about ethical rehabilitation, lectures without slides, stories without names. She described compassion as procedure's missing variable. Students listened, not to facts but cadence. When asked about miracles, she answered with silence, letting absence define what words could not. Mason Reed attended one session quietly from the back, unseen. He left before applause, his face unreadable. Outside, winter light glowed pale across parking lots and bare trees. In her pocket, Lauren carried a stone she'd picked from the pine clearing months before, its surface etched with faint rope grooves. She kept it as reminder and warning. Mercy requires risk. That night she placed it on her windowsill, where morning would find it warmed by sun. The world moved on, headlines fading, new crises blooming. Yet beneath all that noise, the quiet legacy of one bear remained, a truth too steady to forget. Reed's redemption began invisibly. He allocated funds to educational grants under false project titles, funneling resources toward field ethics programs. His signature disappeared from press releases, replaced by faceless boards. At home, he reread the old case files, deleting them one by one, not from duty, but from shame. The pine tree photo remained on his desk. He never moved it. At night, he dreamed of rope fibers unraveling slowly, the sound gentle, almost forgiving. Guilt transformed into maintenance, quiet and consistent. Years later, a foundation would surface, the Talon Trust, its origins vague, its mission clear, to prevent cruelty written off as tradition. Reed never sought credit. Some absolution works only when anonymous. Across valleys and rivers, the forest continued without ceremony, erasing human traces grain by grain. Redemption, like decay, moved invisibly, but always forward. The years folded into layers of memory, each softer than the last. Ethan aged without notice, his reflection more weathered than man. The wilderness shaped his solitude into purpose. Every few months, he returned to the ridge where the rope had once held life hostage. The pine still stood, scar healed over, bark thick with new growth. Around it, the forest hummed with insects and wind. He would stand there until dusk, then leave without trace. No prayers, no words. Some acts are complete only when left unspoken. He carried no camera, fearing that proof would cheapen faith. To those who asked, he said nothing of bears, only of time and patience. Yet some nights, distant across valleys, a low sound rose through darkness. Not threat, not warning, just presence. And Ethan would close his eyes, breathing once in rhythm with the unseen. Winter returned again, sharp and absolute. Snow muffled the world until even thought felt quiet. In the valley, Talon moved like a shadow carved from wind. His fur had grown dense and silvered, his limp barely noticeable now. Streams froze in intricate patterns that broke under his weight. Above him, ravens followed, curious and reverent. He crossed paths with wolves once more. They parted without confrontation. Balance had returned. On the southern ridge, Ethan tracked weather sensors, unaware they shared the same horizon. The forest carried both their stories in its breath. Years of cruelty, defiance, and mercy condensed into this. Two survivors existing parallel, neither captive nor conqueror. The sky dimmed to violet, snowfall softening tracks as soon as they formed. By morning, only silence would remain, proof not of absence, but of peace reclaimed quietly by the living earth itself.
Spring broke through the valley like a long-delayed breath. Meltwater braided silver threads across the ground where ash once gathered. Talon followed the thaw uphill, drawn by scent rather than memory. Beneath layers of fur, scars itched where new skin pressed against old injury. He tore into dead logs for grubs, pawed thawed roots, and shook water from his coat until the forest shimmered around him. No fence, no hum of machines, only the persistent choir of insects returning. Far below, Ethan watched storm clouds spill over peaks, the same rhythm that once hid their escape. He marked temperature and wind, but each note in his journal bent toward another purpose, proof that wildness still resisted containment. The earth hummed quietly under boots and paws alike, and somewhere between weather readings and heartbeat, both man and bear learned what survival sounded like when no one was listening. The season turned gentle, masking old violence beneath blossoms and pollen. Ethan moved through spruce thickets repairing sensors, each ping of data echoing the pulse he once tracked by touch. He found claw marks on a cedar, deep and deliberate, sap still bleeding fresh. The pattern matched the rhythm burned into memory, Talon's reach, unmistakable. Ethan pressed his hand against the grooves, feeling warmth where there should have been cold. Distance became irrelevant. Connection lived in repetition. He smiled without knowing, the expression private and fleeting. Around him, birds startled and settled again, as if granting witness. Downstream, paw prints softened under rain, erasing evidence before discovery. Freedom survived precisely because it left nothing permanent. By nightfall, only wind remained to translate between them, carrying scent, dust, and the shared truth that some rescues never finish. They simply change shape until both sides forget the boundaries of saving.
News of an ecological survey reached Ethan through a colleague's casual mention. New investors, new fences, new plans for safety disguised as stewardship. He read the proposal under lantern light, every paragraph echoing the same lie: control rewritten as care. Memories clawed upward, uninvited. Fluorescent lights, rope burns, the sound of locks. Outside, wind moved through pines like a restless conscience. Talon roamed somewhere beyond those ridges, unaware of paperwork threatening to redraw his horizon. Ethan folded the documents and fed them to the flame. Paper twisted, blackened, disappeared, leaving only drifting ash that smelled faintly of resin. He knew what came next: surveys, sedatives, collars. He also knew how easily compliance masquerades as protection. The fire dimmed, sparks vanishing into the indifferent dark. Some battles never end. They only wait for someone weary enough to fight them again, silently, with nothing left but conviction and breath. Rain returned that night, washing soot from stone. Ethan trekked higher toward the ridge, chasing signal strength for his field radio. Between static bursts, he heard fragments. Crews mobilizing, tranquilizers prepared, traps staged along migration routes. Bureaucracy had found its coordinates. He moved faster, not certain of purpose until motion itself became answer. Down in the valley, Talon felt the shift before sound reached him. His nose lifted, tasting human scent braided with rain. Instinct pressed him deeper into forest where mist cloaked everything equally. The hunt was administrative, polite on paper, but in practice it carried the same hunger that had tied him once to the pine. Above, thunder built without threat, echoing through ribs and stone alike. Ethan reached the overlook at dawn, watching fog roll like slow fire across the canopy, and knew the line between rescue and resistance had vanished entirely. The first trap glinted faintly under wet leaves, metal disguised as necessity. Ethan disarmed it by instinct, fingers steady despite cold. Nearby, tire impressions marred soft earth. Boots had followed recently. He moved upstream, eyes mapping terrain the way memory maps guilt. Talon remained invisible yet present, his movements too broad for tracking, his intelligence older than pursuit. Every snapped branch told a story of proximity. Ethan found evidence of tranquilizer darts, each one cleanly missed or withdrawn. Someone else was trying to write an ending nature hadn't agreed to. By dusk, rain thickened to fog, swallowing all distance. The forest blurred into gray persistence, man and bear circling unseen within the same boundary of defiance. Somewhere between caution and faith, Ethan whispered a thought he did not need to speak. Survival was no longer rescue, it was a shared refusal to obey extinction quietly. Days bled together under constant overcast. Search teams retreated one by one, equipment soaked, excuses ready. The forest kept its secrets. Ethan waited until the last truck disappeared beyond the ridge, then descended through fog to where the traps once gleamed. Only disturbed soil remained. Talon had moved on, leaving no trail except faint heat still rising from the ground where he'd slept. Ethan crouched there, hand hovering above the imprint, feeling warmth ghost through his palm. The air smelled of moss and renewal. Somewhere nearby, branches flexed under heavy weight, but no shape emerged. He stood quietly, neither calling nor searching further. The wild does not return greetings, it accepts them. Turning away, he realized that silence had become their final language, an agreement deeper than trust, formed from the mutual understanding that both had been broken and rebuilt by the same mercy.
Summer arrived, filling the valley with scent and noise. Rivers swelled with meltwater, carrying echoes of unseen lives. Ethan recorded weather data, his reports reduced to numbers stripped of story. The forest thrived without acknowledging him. Somewhere beyond the next range, Talon marked territory anew, his claws carving hieroglyphs into bark. Wolves shadowed him, but never pressed, learning hierarchy by observation. Each sunrise revealed further distance between man and bear, yet an invisible thread persisted, thin, indestructible, unspoken. Ethan began sketching instead of writing, pages filled with outlines of trees, scars, storm paths. The act became confession. Some drawings he burned, others he kept, folded like promises. The work felt pointless and holy at once, an attempt to translate memory into quiet proof that compassion leaves traces only when no one insists on claiming them. The forest breathed through it all, unconcerned, endlessly alive. Autumn brought color too vivid to last. Leaves ignited into gold and rust before falling soundlessly across damp ground. Ethan felt the year turning within him, a slow drift from urgency to reverence. He hiked the old fire road again, carrying no equipment, only presence. Every step retraced ghosts, the rope's shadow, the wolf's circle, the scent of fear turned faith. At the clearing, the pine still stood, thicker now, its scar sealed beneath new bark. He placed his palm against it, feeling pulse rather than memory. Far off, thunder rolled without rain, the sky rehearsing endings. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though no fire burned. Somewhere unseen, a large shape moved through foliage, steady and sure. He did not look toward it. Some recognitions need distance to stay true. The forest accepted his silence as offering, closing gently around both absence and belonging.
Winter crept earlier than expected, bringing long nights stitched with cold stars. The world seemed smaller under frost. Ethan lived in a cabin near the pass, spending evenings beside an oil lamp that hissed softly. He read reports of Foundation work funded anonymously, programs teaching rescue ethics in distant states. The name Talon Trust appeared occasionally, never linked to its origins. He smiled faintly at the coincidence. Outside, snow erased tracks faster than they formed. Somewhere in that same season, Talon hibernated under drifts, heartbeat slowed, body repairing itself through stillness. Two lives carried on in parallel quietude, unseen by the noise that measures significance. When storms came, wind moaned down the chimney like an ancient voice repeating one sentence: "What was saved must now be left alone." Ethan listened, grateful that solitude had become meaning rather than punishment. When spring thaw returned again, the valley sang with water and light. Streams burst their banks, scenting the air with cold minerals. Ethan walked the perimeter of the reserve, older now, beard silvering, steps measured but certain. Time had softened every edge except conviction. At a bend in the trail, claw marks marred a birch, fresh, high, unmistakable. He touched them gently, feeling the living tree vibrate with wind. Somewhere beyond the rise, Talon moved unseen, massive, deliberate, eternal. The world had forgotten the headlines. History had erased their names. Yet nature remembers not through monuments, but continuance. Ethan closed his eyes, inhaling damp air heavy with pollen and silence. In that inhalation existed everything: the rope, the rain, the freedom. He turned back toward the trail, leaving no sign behind. The forest folded the moment into itself, content to keep secrets that ended in peace.
The thaw deepened into green abundance. Ferns uncurled, rivers swelled, and insects wrote invisible music in the air. Ethan resumed fieldwork, his solitude a quiet profession. Each evening, he sat outside the cabin, watching clouds drift like slow herds over ridges. Memories no longer hurt. They hummed like distant thunder, present but far. Somewhere upriver, Talon moved through meadows, heavy and calm, his steps carving shallow troughs in the wet grass. The world had stopped naming him, and that anonymity was freedom. Wolves trailed behind sometimes, drawn by habit rather than hunger. Ethan imagined the rhythm of their lives intersecting unseen, his own breath matching theirs for a moment before diverging again. The forest, unbothered by meaning, continued its patient work of restoration, stitching over every scar it could reach. Only those who had once witnessed cruelty understood that silence itself can become an act of protection. Years turned like steady wheels. The foundation that bore Talon's name expanded quietly, teaching rescue ethics to new generations. Lauren Grant led workshops in towns that smelled of rain and pine. She spoke of restraint, the bravery of stillness, the power in non-interference. Students listened, faces half-lit by projector glow. Reed's name never surfaced, yet his funding fingerprints built every scholarship they received. Across the continent, Ethan worked under contracts that expired quickly, his address never fixed. Every paycheck funded equipment for research teams he'd never meet. Each action, though small, rewrote a single corner of history. In distant ridges, the bear slept, woke, and roamed without awareness of the influence his existence had seeded. The world healed itself in fragments. Laws passed quietly, fences lowered, hunts reduced. Mercy had multiplied through persistence rather than proclamation, its echoes threaded through the work of people who'd once witnessed impossible survival. Days lengthened again, pale light stretching through the rafters. The clinic's routines thickened with caution. Talon's appetite returned in earnest, and with strength came restlessness. His claws scraped concrete like a metronome of frustration. Ethan watched, recognizing the hunger in motion, the way captivity corrodes courage. Reed convened meetings, voices sharp with risk assessments. Lauren kept silent, eyes on her clipboard, but heart elsewhere. Each line of protocol built another wall between them and the wilderness waiting outside. The wolves' howls had grown distant, yet their absence felt heavier than their presence. On the 12th morning, frost melted from the glass in tear-like streaks. Talon stood fully, shoulders high, head tilted toward unseen wind. The gesture looked less like recovery and more like remembrance. Behind the reflection, Ethan caught his own tired silhouette,
realizing that both of them were healing from the same invisible leash. Bureaucracy thickened like fog. Reed's office filled with calls, each one layering another justification for removing the bear. Words such as risk and public pressure replaced compassion. Outside the window, winter sunlight glared off snowfields, blinding and pure, indifferent to reason. Ethan reviewed the transfer order folded in his pocket, the signature a brand across conscience. Lauren found him at the enclosure one evening, but said nothing. Understanding passed between silences. Inside, Talon paced, the rhythm of confinement echoing like a clock counting down. Machines blinked, cameras recorded compliance. Somewhere in that mechanical hush, a decision began forming. Quiet, inevitable, as natural as thaw following frost. The forest beyond the ridge shimmered faintly in twilight. Freedom existed less as destination and more as demand, carried in the pulse of everything that had ever refused to die quietly.
The valley entered its 5th year of quiet. Wildlife populations thrived. The old rehabilitation center became a research institute under new leadership. Photographs of past rescues lined its hallways, but none bore names. Visitors paused before a single image, an uncaptioned sketch of a man beside a sleeping bear beneath pines. The caption read only, "Compassion needs no language." Lauren had donated it anonymously, copied from memory. Reed had retired long before, living in solitude near the coast. Ethan's whereabouts remained unrecorded. Yet those who studied conservation laws cited the Talon Trust's impact with reverence, unaware they spoke of ghosts. Out in the northern range, the bear himself endured, older, slower, magnificent. Scars silvered beneath fur, muscles still thundered beneath hide. The forest bent around his path, a monarch without ceremony, carrying living proof that survival, once achieved, becomes its own quiet legacy. Winter sharpened again. Ethan traveled south for a temporary posting, measuring snowfall across remote stations. Loneliness had refined into calm routine. At night, he watched auroras ripple like curtains through frozen sky, their colors bleeding across snowfields in silence. Each shimmer reminded him of breath seen in cold air, the visible evidence of something unseen but alive. He thought of Talon then, perhaps buried deep in hibernation, the slow miracle of a heartbeat surviving beneath ice and earth. The distance between them no longer hurt, it defined balance. One belonged to wilderness, the other to memory, yet both sustained the same fragile promise. When storms passed, he wrote in his logbook only one line: "Peace is a living thing." Outside, frost-laden branches bowed low but did not break. Morning would thaw them, as it always had, proving endurance is simply nature's most elegant form of faith.
Years later, the first documentary about humane conservation debuted quietly online. No narrator, no interviews, just long, slow footage of wind over trees, snow melt in creeks, and tracks dissolving in rain. Its final frame lingered on a distant figure crossing a valley. A bear, massive, solitary, shoulder scar catching sunlight before disappearing into mist. The credits mentioned no creators. Viewers debated authenticity. Experts claimed composite footage. But those who had once stood near that forest knew. The simplicity of it all carried weight beyond explanation. Among them was Lauren, older now, watching in her office, tears unnoticed until they cooled on her skin. Reed watched too, somewhere else, understanding without confession. Ethan never saw it. Connection required screens, and he lived where reception failed. The wild had spoken its own requiem, wordless and absolute, reminding those who sought closure that some stories end only in continuation. Spring returned softer than before. The Foundation's programs expanded overseas, training rescuers to treat silence as part of rehabilitation. Lauren retired, leaving her journals sealed in archives. The final entry read simply, "Healed things belong to themselves." Meanwhile, the pine clearing reverted entirely to forest, wildflowers covering its roots, bees moving between them with unhurried purpose. Talon was sighted once more that year, grainy footage from a ranger's drone, disproving the myth of his death. The clip lasted 4 seconds, a vast brown form turning toward the lens, eyes bright, then vanishing into trees. Officials labeled it inconclusive. Locals called it enough. Ethan heard of it months later, sitting beside a mountain stream. He smiled faintly and let the water erase his footprints. Some returns are not meant for reunion, but for reassurance, proof that mercy, when genuine, has no need to be witnessed twice.
On the 5th anniversary of the rescue, the valley stood quiet under gold light. Snow had retreated to high peaks, leaving streams clear as glass. Ethan hiked alone to the place where everything began. The pine was enormous now, its scars hidden beneath thick bark. Around it, young saplings crowded for space, their branches brushing his coat. He knelt, brushing soil from a buried length of old rope half-turned to dust. The earth had nearly claimed it, forgiveness by absorption. He left it there, pressing his palm to ground until heartbeat and soil thudded together. Far below, wolves called to one another across distance, a chorus older than grief. He listened until echoes thinned into wind. The forest breathed, wide and unbroken. Each exhale a reminder that survival's truest form isn't victory. It's quiet, continuous presence after the noise has ended. Evening descended slowly, pouring honey-colored light through the trees. Ethan remained until shadows fused with dusk. When he finally rose, the valley glowed faintly, mist rolling in ribbons along the floor. From somewhere unseen, a single low growl rumbled across distance, deep, resonant, unmistakable. It vibrated through ground and air alike, an unambiguous declaration, alive. He did not turn toward it. Recognition required no sight. The sound lingered, only fading when night completed its claim. Stars appeared one by one, ancient witnesses to new beginnings. Ethan walked back down the trail, leaving no prints behind, his silhouette dissolving into the same darkness that once saved them both. The pine stood tall in moonlight, bark catching silver. Around it, insects hummed like distant applause. The wild had kept its promise. The story, reduced now to breath and echo, ended exactly where mercy began, inside silence, carried forward by wind.
Dawn broke clean over the range, sunlight cutting gold through mist. The forest shimmered, every droplet a small universe of light. Ethan woke in his cabin to the hush that follows understanding rather than silence. Years had gentled him, strength had turned inward, quiet and steady. He packed his tools, leaving behind only sketches pinned to the wall. Trees, storms, fragments of a life rebuilt through endurance. Down in the valley, Talon crossed a meadow, dew rising from his fur in ghostly ribbons. Time no longer separated them, only space filled with acceptance. Each lived what the other had granted, the right to continue unobserved. The air smelled of pine and thawing earth. The past existed only as texture beneath the present. The forest, unconcerned with gratitude or grief, held both creatures within its endless breath, proving that freedom needs no witness to remain sacred. Spring bled into full summer, green unrolling over every surface. The Talon Trust launched its largest initiative yet, educating remote communities on coexistence and preservation. Across lecture halls and classrooms, children traced outlines of bears on paper, learning empathy before fear could teach them otherwise. Lauren's recorded lessons played like hymns for patience. Far from that noise, Ethan marked another year in solitude, his journal filled with weather instead of reflection. One evening, he paused mid-sentence, pen hovering. The horizon burned with sunset, the same amber that had once stained the clearing. He realized legacy had nothing to do with buildings or names. It lived wherever cruelty met interruption. The forest beyond his window rustled lightly, as if acknowledging. Somewhere out there, Talon foraged along the riverbank. No longer story or symbol, only animal, alive and unburdened by the weight of his own survival.
Time drifted with the sound of water. Rivers widened, changing courses as quietly as memory erodes. Ethan aged into gentleness. His shoulders bowed not by regret, but by reverence. He spoke rarely now, but when words came, they arrived measured and soft, shaped by distance and gratitude. His hair silvered like frost on bark. Across mountains, Talon roamed slower, his gait deliberate, confident, the limp reduced to rhythm. Winter found them both in different dens, one built of wood and fire, one of earth and roots. The world above continued indifferent, yet somehow fair. Sometimes the wind carried scents between them, smoke to fur, pine to paper. Neither sought reunion. Continuity was enough. What they had shared belonged not to memory, but to law, the quiet exchange that keeps wildness breathing, reminding both man and creature that survival is best honored through distance respected. Years folded into myth. Tourists came for photographs, unaware of the story beneath the soil they walked on. Guides spoke of a ghost bear, immense and unthreatening, seen only at dawn near the northern ridge. No traps, no tracks, just presence. Children pointed at claw marks high on ancient trees, eyes wide with wonder. The locals told it differently, that Mercy once walked these woods disguised as defiance. The pine clearing remained untouched by construction, protected under quiet decree. Ethan visited less, content with knowing rather than seeing. He carried the forest inside him now, its patience reshaping the rhythm of his heart. The world changed around them. Laws evolved, minds softened, but some things stayed. In wind, in shadow, in the subtle tremor of life moving without permission, the legend of Talon lived not as ghost or miracle, but as a promise fulfilled through silence.
Late autumn turned the forest copper. Leaves fell like thin embers, carpeting the trails Ethan once mapped by memory. He walked slowly now, cane in hand, breath fogging pale. The air smelled the same as that night years ago. Wet bark, fear, and hope intertwined. Near the ridge, he found the scarred pine again, taller, stronger, its wound nearly invisible. He leaned against it, feeling the heartbeat of sap beneath bark. The forest spoke without sound, every rustle a word he somehow understood. Time folded inward, collapsing distance between then and now. In that stillness, he felt both the young man dragging a wounded bear and the old one standing alone, bound by gratitude. Overhead, crows passed like slow shadows, wings cutting sunlight into fragments. Each flicker felt like benediction. The rope, the blood, the mercy, all had turned to earth. Nothing was lost. It had simply changed shape. Snow came early that year, drifting soundlessly across ridges. Talon moved through the white world with practiced ease, his breath clouds merging with sky. The forest yielded beneath his weight, branches bowing, ice cracking softly under paw. Age had narrowed his range but not his purpose. He hunted less, wandered more. His life stretched thin between survival and memory. In a clearing, he paused, inhaling a scent buried under snow. Human, old, faint, familiar. He lifted his head, listening. Wind answered from afar, carrying nothing but the sound of trees sighing. The moment passed, brief as lightning seen through fog. He turned and vanished into deeper woods, leaving only a pattern of tracks too symmetrical to mistake. Above, the moon lifted, white and immense, the same light that once fell on a man's trembling hands cutting rope in a rain-soaked clearing long ago.
Winter thickened until all motion slowed. Ethan remained in his cabin, wrapped in blankets, reading old field notes. The ink had faded, but the meaning endured. Each line carried weather, coordinates, and echoes of instinct. Outside, snow pressed against the windows, muffling every sound except the steady tick of cooling wood. He felt no loneliness, only gravity drawing him toward stillness. Memories visited without cruelty, the wolf's eyes, Lauren's trembling hands, the moment breath resumed beneath his palm. He understood now that salvation is mutual, each rescuer saved in return. Closing the journal, he looked toward the window where darkness merged with frost. Somewhere out there, the forest kept its vigil, and the bear he once freed dreamed under layers of ice. They had traded names for peace, and it was enough. Survival had outlasted story, becoming the quiet pulse beneath the living earth. By early thaw, Ethan's cabin stood empty. Rangers found his notes stacked neatly on the table, maps rolled beside them, boots by the door. Outside, footprints led to the ridge and vanished into meltwater. No sign of struggle, no farewell. Only presence, interrupted. They left the cabin untouched, uncertain whether absence meant ending or continuation. That spring, new growth swallowed the path entirely. In the same season, a ranger on patrol captured fleeting footage near the northern valley, a human figure and a massive bear crossing a river in opposite directions. The video blurred before anyone could analyze it. Officials dismissed it as coincidence, but locals whispered otherwise. The forest, indifferent to explanation, simply resumed breathing. Some said the man became part of it. Others said he found what he had once set free. The truth, like mist at sunrise, existed only long enough to disappear.
Seasons layered endlessly. Grass covered fallen branches, moss softened stones once marked by fear. The valley thrived, rivers clear, air sharp with pine. Children in nearby towns grew up learning the story of the nameless man and the bear who taught him mercy, though details blurred with retelling. No monuments rose, no plaques declared memory. Only the forest persisted, wide and awake. In its heart, life moved as it always had, quiet, certain, cyclical. Wolves birthed new litters. Birds rebuilt nests in the same scarred trees. The name Talon faded from human tongues, but remained written in wind, carried between ridges like a song without words. Somewhere within that chorus of green and shadow, the line between beginning and ending disappeared entirely. All that remained was movement, constant,
forgiving, endless as breath itself. Years later, a traveler hiked through the northern reserve at dusk. He followed no map, guided only by the hum of distant water. The forest glowed with late sunlight, pines silvering in the wind. In a clearing stood a single immense tree, bark ridged and darker where lightning had once struck. At its base, faint grooves cut into the soil formed two shapes, one broad, one smaller, side by side, long weathered by rain. The traveler knelt, tracing the impressions without comprehension. Around him, the forest deepened into stillness. A breeze carried the low, rolling sound of something vast moving through the distance. Not menacing, not mournful, simply present. It faded as twilight closed, leaving the air clean and whole. The traveler rose, unaware he had stepped into the closing breath of a story that never truly ended, only merged back into the living silence of the wild.